It is Tuesday, September 14th, 2021. I want today to talk, I want to say this first of all. I didn't get enough sleep last night. I was woken early this morning and then wasn't able to get back to sleep. So I'm also recording this outside of where I am situated these days. So there may be some background noise. I tried to find a spot to minimize that. I don't have total privacy right now because I am helping my family member do some renovations at his place. And so I'm in his environment right now, and I'm not entirely comfortable recording these kinds of things in the presence of my brother. So I apologize for background noise. I'll try and minimize it and edit out what is overly offensive. So what I have been guided to do this. In fact, like I said in one of my previous episodes, I was guided to do this about 3 months ago, and it would have made a lot more sense in hindsight to have followed that guidance because I had a lot more privacy than I do right now. Nonetheless, here I am. This is a very, very important subject that I wanted to discuss today. And it came up for me when I awoke this morning. It was very sort of at the forefront of my mind. And that is paradigms and paradigm shifts. And to me, this is an extremely important subject. And I think it's relevant to many people, whether they're aware of it or not. And this term might be loosely used or applied, but I think it requires or would benefit from being more deeply discussed and understood. So what is a paradigm? A paradigm is a set of beliefs and experiences that define your reality. And it usually involves a lot of assumptions as well. So let's say, for example, just because I like to give practical examples, and as much as it's possible, I like to give practical examples that I myself have personally experienced. But let's say you grew up in a fundamentalist family, and so they have a whole set of beliefs and rules around, what is acceptable and what can be talked about, how it can be expressed, and they have a whole set of terminology that they use in language to communicate those beliefs. So they would be able to, for example, take a particular word and use that word, and then everyone within that context would have a fairly common shared set of understandings about what that term or word means in that context. And there are people outside of that context, or who weren't, say, for example, fundamentalists, might have another set of beliefs and assumptions and definitions that they would use to describe and understand and to describe and understand reality. Now, within the fundamentalist set of paradigm, they are also aware that there are people who are outside of their belief system who hold differing or opposing or challenging beliefs that would contradict their set of beliefs. And so they will have built into their belief system a whole set of arguments or positions to counter the opposing beliefs. So let's say somebody outside of the fundamentalist paradigm believes that, sex outside of marriage is totally fine and it happens all the time. Well, the person in the fundamentalist paradigm might say, well, that these people are wrong. It's evil. They're not following scripture, and so on. So that part of their belief system which is what a paradigm really is, would be built into it, would be a whole series of defense mechanisms to preserve their paradigm, so that so that they can function in reality. Now, this can be taken to different levels, of course, and it can go to extremes where people will literally deny reality to the point where it actually becomes detrimental, where reality itself will actually, at some point, conflict with their reality to the point where it becomes untenable or unsustainable. And if we look at, for example, the cultural clashes that are going on right now, and the U.S. is a good example because it's so dramatic. We have now we have this. It tends to be often it's sort of politically aligned, although there's a lot of people sort of in the middle, which is kind of, from my perspective, a bit of a cowardly position, because you're this is a huge subject. I'm going to try and keep it brief. It's a really big subject, but so we have a cultural, we have people who are more liberal and people who are more conservative, and there's a culture clash because their paradigms conflict with each other. And so if the liberal paradigm was proven to be accurate, it would completely undermine and discredit the conservative paradigm, and vice versa. And so as the paradigms diverge, the more you go down the path, more extreme on the left, more extreme on the right, the more these sort of paradigms are diametrically opposed to each other. And each becomes increasingly untenable in the face of the others, because what happens is that reality at some point will conflict so much with somebody's extremist paradigm that they will go to the point where they will actually, for example, engage in violence or political violence or social violence or whatever, because it's sort of becomes like a last resort to try and preserve their paradigm, even if it is completely corrupt and defunct or untenable. Now, within that, though, within this concept of paradigms, there's one of the keys to this, understanding this, is terminology. So to apply it to the field that we're sort of discussing here, for example, if I say the word spiritual, inside of my community, sort of within the New Age community, and within that community, there's a whole subset of communities that are encompassed within it. I have an understanding of what the word spiritual means, and somebody else has an understanding of what the word spiritual means, and we can have a conversation and both use that word, although in fact we might actually have fairly significantly different understandings of the word spiritual. So if you want to have a conversation with somebody that is actually very deep and meaningful and substantial, you have to kind of at least have a common understanding of what that word spiritual means, or at least understand how your definitions differ. So I had to put this in a practical perspective. I can give you an example in my own life, which occurred in my early 20s, where I went through a process where I gained a lot of deeper understanding of some of these concepts and terms. And I think it'll become self-evident why I'm going to do that. So I will proceed. So I was in my early 20s. I had traveled and lived in different parts of Canada, exposing myself to different cultures within Canadian society. And this is back at a time when travel was not as common as it is now. So, there tended to be more distinct expressions of society that had been rooted in areas for long periods of time. Like, for example, Quebec is more of a French culture, has quite a its culture is quite a bit different than other parts of Canada. So anyway, I go and I do all this, and then I come back and I end up living in the woods for 2 years, off grid, completely off grid, no running water, no electricity. I'm living in a little cabin in the woods, and on a cooperative. And I go, I become good friends with someone I considered my mentor, and I believe I have actually stated to him that I considered him my mentor for many years, who also lives on that land, also off grid. And what I would do is I would go over to his place many, many, many times in the evenings and talk. And he is somebody who was very academically inclined. I've mentioned him before. I'm going to call him Fritz. Everybody called him Fritz because he was of German heritage. I believe his name was Reinhardt, but everyone called him Fritz, and so that's what I'm going to refer to him as. And so I would go over every evening, and we would sit there with oil lamps and talk for hours. And like I said, he was somebody who was very academically inclined, but also had studied a lot of esoteric subjects, and extremely well read. And he was probably 10, 15 years older than me. And still is, actually. But so what happened was that very kindly and very generously, he would spend like insane amounts of time, and we would just sit there and talk and talk and talk and talk, and I would ask question after question after question after question, and we would go into these very, very, very deep subjects. And so over time, we built a common frame of reference where we could use a word to describe a very deep subject, and we knew that we had a shared understanding of what that word represented. So now, excuse me, as time goes on, I can, pardon me while I have a drink of water. As time goes on, now I can use a term or phrase in a conversation, which will represent a very complex and deep subject, but we both know that we both have a shared understanding of what that represents. So rather than sitting there and talking for 3 hours about that particular concept, we've achieved a state of mutual understanding. And so we can, and as time goes on, we can have conversations that become increasingly deep and meaningful because we have spent all this time developing a shared understanding. And if somebody else at that point was to walk along and sit down at the table beside us and listen to us speaking, they would not really understand everything we were conveying to each other through these concepts and words. Because, like I said, we've spent hours discussing this terminology that we're using to communicate with each other. So we can thus exchange a very deep, very meaningful concepts back and forth with each other very quickly because of this shared understanding. Now, how does this relate to paradigms? Well, everybody is functioning in a paradigm, which, like I said early on, is an understanding and a set of assumptions and beliefs about reality. That many people do not even realize that they actually operate within a paradigm, because they just assume that they do. And, this is why, for example, traveling to foreign cultures and spending time in foreign cultures or alien situations is so invigorating, because you arrive in a place which has a completely different set of values and belief systems, and it can be extremely stimulating because you're now exposed to a completely different reality that's functioning right next door to yours. So I have a paradigm, a community might have a paradigm, a country may have a paradigm, a shared set of beliefs and understandings, even if within that paradigm there's conflicting ideas and so forth. At least we have a general understanding that if you're traveling in the United States, you're going to be operating within a certain set of shared beliefs. Now, someone like me living in Canada or someone in Europe might look at, for example, America and go like, okay, you guys are crazy. Like, we don't understand why you don't have a public system of medical care for everybody that isn't based on, where you don't need to buy insurance for medical care or whatever. Canada, for example, also kind of has a slightly different belief system that is less sort of radically individualistic as you have in the United States. So we also don't understand, gun laws and things like that the United States has that are particular to it, because part of the American identity is this rather extreme form of, individualism, which conflicts with the collective welfare of the nation in many regards. So anyway, I'm just trying to get at the point that there are all these, we all operate within these paradigms now. Some of us are aware that we're operating within a paradigm, and some of us just accept it innately without questioning it and don't even realize we are. So somebody, for example, who's less well-traveled or less open-minded might, for example, like just completely discredit Middle Eastern culture, right? So, and that's their way of dealing with these conflicting realities. Or, because to the people in the Middle East, their culture, their reality is valid, and and everything outside of that isn't. This is a very primitive way of dealing with ideas and reality, which is to just become extremely defensive. And like I said, nations have gone to war over ideologies or shared beliefs that conflict with others, right? So there's a few things within all of this, right? One is you have to have a common frame of reference, and that takes effort. This is why within this scientific community, they will spend a phenomenal amount of time in academia or in the scientific community defining terms so that they can speak a shared language and that they can convey a tremendous amount of knowledge and information very quickly. Because they know that when they use that term, whatever it is, like, for example, the term exponential, it's a logarithmic scale. That means, that when something grows exponentially, it tends to be, in technical terms, it tends to be more significant than what most people just, when they use the term exponential, what it means. It has a definition that's very precise. So in the spiritual community, like I said, we use terms like spirituality, or we use, when we're talking about psychic phenomenon and stuff like that, we're throwing around terms all the time. And I suspect that actually, because we don't have a common frame of reference with clearly defined terms, where actually a lot of people are saying things, and then people are hearing those things without fully understanding or having a shared set of beliefs about what that term actually means. So you could literally, like, for example, the word spirituality is a vast concept, because spirituality to somebody in India who grew up in a more traditional, upbringing and within that culture, spirituality means something very different than it does to, say, somebody who grew up in the Midwest United States. So it matters because it matters a lot, because we can think, excuse me, pardon me, I'm going to take another swig of water here. It matters a lot because we can think we're actually communicating when we're not. We're saying different things. Yeah, but we make all of these assumptions. Now, sometimes people make these assumptions because they're just lazy, right? They're intellectually lazy. And sometimes it's practical. You just don't have time to reach a shared consensus about what do I mean when I say spiritual. I had a spiritual experience. Well, what does that mean? So now, there's another important concept. Well, let me just make sure I've wrapped that up. So yeah, we're all walking around. We have, based on our life experiences and our study and our, our experience of life, we operate within a paradigm. So a couple, one of the reasons I think people kind of like being coupled is because over time, the couple, develops a shared understanding. It becomes very comfortable, and the wife can say to the husband X, and the husband knows exactly what the wife means. Whereas somebody down the street wouldn't really pick up on all of the implications of what they're actually saying to each other. And so then when the relationships becomes threatened, the individuals are actually going like, oh, part of them is going like, oh my God, I don't want to go put in all this time and effort with another person to try to reach that level of shared understanding. So typically, as the relationship begins, the two are forming a shared set of beliefs, or at least a shared understanding of each other's set of beliefs, so that they can be in a state of comfort that just requires a lot less effort and energy to share with each other. Whereas somebody outside of the relationship wouldn't really have that level of understanding or awareness that they share collectively between the two of them. Now, a paradigm shift is another really important concept. So if you are operating, I guess I'm getting the impression here that I have not fully described this concept to the extent that I desire. Right. So, thank you. So, this is very important because basically what's happening is that individuals, couples, families, your social network, the people that you hang out with, we all function and operate within these realities that we have constructed based on our experience. And it's like we're all function within our paradigm and our belief system. It becomes the reality, and the reality that we believe in and that we have defined for ourselves through our experiences literally shape and define our experiences. So you'll often hear people talk about how to shift your reality or change your reality or manifest, what you want or things like that. And the importance of what you believe, how it literally alters your experience of reality. And there's a tremendous amount of truth within that. It's very powerful. And however, I would argue that a lot of people have never actually completely delved into the depths of their own particular paradigm. There's still an awful lot of assumptions being made that, X equals Y or whatever the case is, that are shaping your experience, that you just assume to be true. Now we can get into what is a paradigm shift. So if I've adequately conveyed this, and I probably haven't, because like I said, we could go on at great length about many of the things I've touched on here already. But let's just say that, to sum that up, that we each live within our own paradigm that we have constructed, and everyone's paradigm, every organism's, every entity, every being has its own experience of reality. They all differ slightly. a tree would have a paradigm that's different from mine, obviously, right? Or a dog would have a paradigm. They have sensory perceptions that I do not have. And so when they're walking around doing their thing, they're experiencing stuff that I'm just not even aware of. Now, this is where it starts to get really interesting. So a paradigm shift is not just taking new experiences and new information and glomming them onto or adding them to your experience. So let's say you're an American and you take a trip to India and you go like, holy shit, this culture is like amazing, like it's completely different. There's all these different religions and religious practices and foods and ways of being, and there's more of a sort of a caste system there, and they in India they place a high value on spiritual exploration and devotion. So they would have a lot of respect for people, say, for example, who went and devoted themselves to a religious or spiritual path and went and maybe went to an ashram. Whereas in America, they would say like, oh, you should go do your own thing and build stuff and, make money and buy a 5-bedroom house in the burbs or whatever it is. Different imperatives. So that's not a paradigm shift. Just like adding and reinforcing your own paradigm and by gaining new knowledge or information is not a paradigm shift. What might look more like a paradigm shift is a spiritual awakening. Let's say you grew up in a traditional American family. You weren't necessarily a fundamentalist, or your family wasn't fundamentalists. But you were aware of that, and you knew that is a way of being, a lifestyle, and so forth. And you also knew that you could go and be an investment banker on Wall Street, or a lawyer, or a doctor, or a farmer, or whatever, right? Those are all function within your paradigm, even if those aren't things that you are going to devote your life to. They're options, they're on the smorgasbord of things that you could do. But let's do, and so, you may have gone to church and growing up a bit, but you weren't like really religious, and, you're aware of all this stuff. It's part of your paradigm. Let's say that you suddenly start, at some point along your path, you suddenly start having psychic experiences. And you're going like, well, what the, I've heard of psychic experiences before, and I've read about it, and, I know that goes on out there, but I just had an out-of-body experience. What the hell? Right now, suddenly, if you think about the implications of something like that, well, what does that mean? Does that suddenly I can exist outside of my body? Well, that's not part of my paradigm, right? Like, I've read about this conceptually, but did this what does that mean that actually can occur? Well, this has like extremely profound and significant implications. That reality is not just physical, and that does that mean that I live forever? I thought I was just born and died, and that was it, right? Or does and if this is a very serious contradiction to my paradigm. It's a fundamental. It fundamentally challenges a whole set of beliefs that I've held my entire life, that have shaped my identity and my experience of reality. So now you're being like significantly challenged, and the implications are astonishing, because like, well, geez, I spent my whole life studying law, and I'm a lawyer, and I have a practice, and what does that mean? Does it mean that all of a sudden that's all of that stuff that I have invested my time in, my whole family, my relationships, it just doesn't have the same value that it used to have, and I've been devoted to this for years? Like, So there are certain kinds of experiences which can be so dramatically challenging to our preconceived idea of what reality is and what it represents, that it can be astonishingly alarming. Because if that experience and the implications of it are so fundamentally challenging to your set of beliefs, you might literally have to change your entire life. And it might even imply that some of the relationships that you are heavily invested in lose a significant amount of their validity or importance. And now suddenly, if you have, and this is very difficult because you can't really describe a spiritual experience. I mean, yeah, if you are talking to somebody who has also had spiritual experiences, you can kind of reach some level of shared understanding about what it's like to have a spiritual experience. But I can never really fully convey to somebody else the full depth of my spiritual experience because it involves my feelings, my senses, and a sense of inner knowing. And it's an experience. And I can't really share I can describe an experience, but I can't really share an experience with somebody else. Now, like I said, other people have had similar experiences, so there can be some sharing of that, but it's limited. Anyway, back to my thing about paradigm shifts. So paradigm shifts tend to be when we have very significant experiences that are so challenging to our belief system that they require a radical reappraisal of our entire understanding of reality. Now, this does not tend to occur very often, and that's probably a good thing, because you would probably go crazy if you were going through very profound paradigm shifts on a regular basis, because they require you to completely change or review or reconsider everything that you know and think and understand to be true. Back, a lot of people have had experiences on LSD back in the 60s, or more recently, ayahuasca has been a method for people to sort of shatter their paradigms and have experiences that are radically different or open them up to radically different beliefs and experiences. And but those people tend to be very adventurous. I mean, to get on a plane and go down into the jungles of Peru for a couple weeks, you have to be a bit brave and a bit open to having yourself be very challenged. And there's a lot of people who just don't have that level of comfort. But what's going to be happening as the veils thin on the planet that we call Earth is that more and more people are going to be going through paradigm shifts. And again, I really encourage people not to apply this term too liberally, because I would suspect that a person, if they are adventurous and open-minded, might have a few paradigm shifts in a lifetime. I have had, and I'm somebody who's explored spirituality intensely for years, maybe a couple paradigm shifts. Now, the other thing that tends to happen when you do have a paradigm shift is that this is really interesting. You look back at your life and your prior experiences, and you can now understand them and see them differently. So you may have had an experience 15 years ago that at the time you interpreted it one way, and now from your new perspective, your new paradigm, you understand and see that experience in a way that you didn't at the time, and in a way that has perhaps deeper and more meaning. And this has been my case. For example, there were things that happened to me when I was a child or when I was young, or that when I had a paradigm shift in my early 20s, when I suddenly became aware of spirituality and began to explore it, I looked back at experiences that I had had in my early childhood and in my youth in a way that now these experiences made sense to me in a way that they didn't before. I saw the patterns and I saw the necessity and I saw the importance of them in ways that I just did not understand at the time. Because when I had those experiences, I lived primarily within the paradigm of that I grew up in. And those experiences were outside of that paradigm. So there was no context for them. There was no way to understand them or define them or even express them. So I had what I now recognize as spiritual or psychic experiences when I was a child that I couldn't even talk about or express because there was no way to do that. I didn't have the language. I didn't have the context. I didn't have the paradigm within to be able to discuss those until I was older and had a new understanding of reality, and had people to express them to who did not think I was crazy, right? So to me, this is like an extremely important concept. One is that it's like the word enlightenment. I see people sometimes describing themselves as enlightened or so-and-so's enlightened or whatever. I've been on the spiritual path for many years. I've had experiences with mystics, sages, gurus, people, from different parts of the world. In my lifetime, I have actually met maybe 4 or 5 people who are enlightened. And I'm going out of my way to sort of encounter these people. It's an extremely uncommon phenomenon. When you're in the presence of somebody who's enlightened, you know it. And if you've never been in the presence of somebody who's enlightened, and then you do at some point, you'll know it too. So it's not a term I would apply liberally to describe people. It's not a common phenomenon. Like just because somebody has some knowledge or studied a particular subject does not mean they're enlightened. Enlightenment is a state of being. It's not the result of gathering knowledge. It's not an intellectual thing, right? So, and it's a rarefied state of being that very few people have attained. And even then, there's degrees of enlightenment as well. So, like I said, I think that's probably a good intro. I'm not even sure how long this is now. These are very deep subjects. I want to encourage people to sort of think about the terminology that they use and whether we're actually communicating clearly with each other, because I think terms are being thrown around loosely without really being fully understood and defined. And so like literally people are saying things to each other and they're not actually quite saying exactly the same thing. It takes a lot of time and effort to build a shared vocabulary that is well defined. Why does this matter? Well, I think we're interested in sharing experiences and communicating clearly with each other. And if we're not actually saying the same things or discussing the same things, but we think we are, then we're not really communicating. And I'm not saying that people adopt my definition of the word spirituality. Spirituality is such a vast term. It probably should just stay that way and just be when we get into more detailed, discussions, that's when it becomes probably more important. The word spirituality is just a broad term that means a lot of things to a lot of people, and we agree to accept that that's what it means. All right, that's probably enough for now. I hope it makes sense, and that there's another thing too. There's another phenomenon when say for example, I was having this conversation with somebody else. It would probably be helpful because that person can help make sure that I'm just not veering off course, or that I haven't skipped over something or omitted something just not deliberately, but just because it's hard sometimes to maintain your train of thought, especially when you're trying to cover something so vast and of significant importance. So again, to sum up, that we're all operating within these beliefs that are limited, right? And even if you think that your belief system is all encompassing, I can virtually promise you, not virtually, I can promise you, you're wrong. It's not. There's other stuff outside of your understanding that you just have not encountered yet or understood yet. I mean, this is one of the things about the spiritual path that is so challenging, is that it's infinite. It goes on and on and on. There are deeper and deeper and deeper levels of understanding and awareness that we can gain. It's infinite, like literally infinite. It goes on forever. There is no end, right? It'll probably go on for millions, billions of years. We will continue to evolve. And so, we might have peak experiences where we get downloads and we have new levels of understanding, but like never for an instant think that you have encompassed all that there is. It's like the Fool card in the tarot. We have to be in that state of constantly being open and constantly questioning our assumptions and our belief systems and our limitations, so that we can overcome them and that we can expand our consciousness. We want to be constantly expanding our consciousness. Once in a while we take breaks where we will sit there for a while and process and integrate, some peak experience we've had or some new understanding that we've had, and it'll gel and we'll go, right? And then at some point we will be challenged again. This happens to me constantly. I will achieve states where I go like, oh God, this is great. I'm just really feeling at ease and at comfort with myself and where I'm at. And then something friggin' crazy will happen and it will challenge me. And it'll bring up things I didn't even know that where I was limited or where I was stuck, right? People, it typically happens with people. People will come into your experience and challenge you and push buttons and trigger you, and then you'll become aware of parts of yourself that are like incomplete. And you're like, oh my God, now I have to go through this whole experience. It goes on and on and on until we are increasing. And here's another thing too. This is based on my own personal experiences. The further down the spiritual path you go, the harder it gets. Like if you're thinking that, you're going to get to a point where everything is just going to make sense and it's all going to be easy and you're just going to be blissed out all the time, forget it. Maybe when you do achieve a state of enlightenment, that'll occur. But what tends to happen is that the lessons get harder and harder and harder, and you get more and more and more challenged on a deeper and deeper and deeper level. So if you're doing this thinking that you're going to just suddenly your life is going to be happy and you're going to be perfect and you're going to just be with your soulmate and you're just going to be living in bliss all the time, you're kidding yourself. You forget it. It's not going to happen. The lessons are going to get harder. Right? I don't want to end on a negative note, because it's actually the most interesting and challenging thing in the world to be on the spiritual path. It's like, forget sports, forget, trying to be, the richest person in the world. The hardest thing that you can do is walk the spiritual path. It's the most challenging thing. If you're open-minded and you're sincere, you want the truth, there is nothing more challenging than being on the spiritual path. All right, that's probably a good place to leave this. 45 minutes in, and I could have gone on for a lot longer. Bye.